Hello there and welcome again to the MCS analysis by Stranti for the November 2019 sitting on GSC Sportwear, where we're going to be going over the strategic analysis. So this is all about seeing the models that apply, thinking about the strategic direction of the company and how we can relate the case to the standard business practices and models that we have to cover as part of the syllabus. So the first thing is just to quickly introduce you to the case in case this is the first video you are watching. This is the sportswear industry, where there is a focus on a very complex, competitive nature within the industry with some changing consumer trends which are a bit tricky to navigate, especially given that GSC are actually appealing to a consumer that is not as influential at the moment in the industry as these sort of changing trends to a more fashionable orientated sportswear consumer, which is where we're seeing a lot of the growth from. So GSC are a leading sportswear brand in Geoland, which are in North America, and they focus on having this really extreme high quality performance as part of all their goods. Now this is at odds with the fashion. They don't care as much about the fashion. They discussed in the history of the company in the pre-scene that they saw a gap in the market for ultra high performance in the early 2000s, and it's worked really well for them. The issue being that at the moment consumer trends are maybe moving slightly more towards style again, which does put them in a problematic place, but we did see their financials are doing pretty reasonable. There is a strong competition though throughout as well, which is a bit of a problem. Despite being one of the largest brands in Geoland and offering really good quality, there's loads of competitors in all the different niches in the market. So it's very interesting, and let's kick off with how this works out. So the majority of this video is going to be dominated by strategic analysis, of course, and this is going to be situated in the rational model. So the analysis that we're going to be going through is all about this rational planning model, where we're looking at how we are now and what we want to be in the future, and how this relates in terms of generic strategies and Ansos matrix, etc. All these theories and how they relate. And the first point of call that we start with is, of course, what we want to be. So the first stage is always going to cover our mission, objectives, how this relates to our stakeholders, and how we want to govern our company and what kind of ethics we want to uphold. So the mission, if you do not recall, is all about why the company exists. Often the mission statement is quite broad, not very focused, and it goes through a stage of sort of fine-tuning from the mission to the vision statement to the objectives, etc. So the purpose is going to be covered of why it exists, what does it want to achieve, strategies, how it will compete with that purpose in mind, and then we've got the values. What do we hold dear to the company? Is it quality? Are we looking to be innovative? Are we looking to be budget friendly? And also the policies. How are we expecting our employees to act? How are we expecting our related companies, such as our suppliers, to act? So this relates to ultimately our balanced scorecard performance measurement, because the balanced scorecard incorporates both quantitative and qualitative, so non-financial aspects, to give us an idea of how the company is doing, and that's how we can translate these missions and visions of GSC, which, by the way, involves the idea of having this really high performance for the sort of dedicated athletes, essentially. So looking for high quality, they have a code of conduct for their suppliers, and their distributors have some restrictions as well to make sure that there's a premiumness about it. And this is where performance measurements comes in. And balanced scorecard, as mentioned, is one of the key ways we can describe that in CIMA or detail that. So if you do not remember, the balanced scorecard is a 4-part approach where we look at the financial, so that could be your profit, whether it's increasing, cash flow, gearing, etc. Then also the learning, so how many high quality recruits are we bringing into the company, how many training projects do we do every year, how much hours were spent on training to get that higher quality, that higher knowledge within the business. Then we also have an internal perspective, which is going to focus on the internal workings of the business, of course, which would be how well we utilize employees. Is there any idle time in the process? We are quite a highly skilled company because we're outsourcing the majority of the labour, though there is some elements in our distribution centres. We want to make sure that our utilisation rates are really high. People aren't wasting time doing things or not being sure about what they're doing next, etc. On-time deliveries to customers, that could be the retail stores or it could be directly to the customers. Employee satisfaction is a big one because you want a motivated workforce to be able to strive for that extra quality. Investment in IT, we know there's a whole department and some bespoke software that they incorporate, so that's going to be a real big one in terms of what we can expect from the company in terms of an internal perspective. We really want to focus in on that as one of the key criterias because it is a critical success factor given how important it is to our outsourced supply chain. Finally, project management, of course, how well they're going, whether they're on time in terms of the planning and the sort of different stages that you've planned out. The customer's perspective, however, flips it in the opposite direction. How many customers, how many complaints, how many sort of services or products rendered or sold. And we've got that customer satisfaction, which could be from a survey. So overall, we've got this well-balanced approach, which doesn't get too narrow, doesn't focus just on the financial, because one of the key improvements of using the balanced scorecard, is that it will make sure there's a long-term success to be had, rather than if you focus just on the financials, you might get some managers or some sort of decisions that are made that are inherently short-term. They're looking for the short-term gain rather than the long-term gain, which might be, we don't want to spend on training this year, that will harm our profits. However, in the future we may be understaffed or underskilled to carry out necessary changes for the betterment of the company. So it's a real long-term, well-rounded approach which we should consider. Then we have governance and how this feeds in to our overall mission, objectives, etc. So one of the key things about governance is that there's a code of corporate governance which is typically utilized in a similar fashion across many jurisdictions. So you don't need to remember the UK one in particular, but it is a good guideline of the kinds of things that are necessary, particularly of listed companies, because stock markets regulate the governance structures of companies, and we didn't get a lot of that, which is what we'll see in just a moment. So just to recap, we've got that separate chairman and CEO, so there's not too much of a conflict of interest between sort of what's best for the business and what's best for themselves. Also, we want independent non-executive directors, an audit, nomination and remuneration committee in appropriate times, a risk management focus, disclosures of directors and pay, which is also important for transparency to all your shareholders, and several other aspects, in particular the annual general meeting, which is also important for the stock market regulations as well. So how does this apply? Well, we're a PLC, public limited company. This means we're on the stock exchange and we're duty bound to a good structure of governance. This will differ slightly maybe because Geoland's a made up place, but we can assume it's the United States to some degree, and this will mean that we do need NEDs. We don't have any mention of those. We don't have any mention of remuneration, nomination or audit committees, but we do have a functional structure which we can maybe utilize depending on the context of the question we're given. But in particular, these will be some key hotspots for potential questions or unseen information. So for example, we might get an issue where the stock market regulations are changing. Maybe we need to incorporate NEDs as part of the Geoland stock market listing, and this will mean that we need to go about the process of adding them. And also we may need to cover the sort of committees, maybe that's already there but just not mentioned yet. It could go either way essentially in terms of the fact that they're not mentioned. That could either mean they're going to come up as a question context, or they're being overlooked for this case. But I have a feeling that in particular non-executive directors and the nomination audit committees, etc., are something that could definitely come up because their absence is pretty suspect given that it's a PLC, and the MCS doesn't often have a PLC as the case company. So just keep that in mind. Now we have to think about how the ethics and the values of the company are upheld and what we're actually seeking as a business. So ethics has played a major part essentially in almost all of the variants across all cases, SCS, MCS, and to a lesser extent the OCS. And this is because it's something that CIMA want to be seen to be testing, and they're trying to encourage these ethical practices. So with this in mind, how do we apply it in terms of the case issues? Well, there could be some issues with working conditions in the supply chain. Now, we have a code of conduct, which is a key commitment as part of our CSR. There isn't a CSR report, so do keep that in mind. It's a bit of a suspect element because CSR should be super important to our branding. So we could definitely have some questions surrounding the topic of a CSR report or certain policies, whether they're a good idea, pros and cons, etc. But there was a lot of cases in the industry where people, or companies rather, that have a well-established supply chain, they think everything's fine, they're not doing any ethical problems, and then suddenly one factory down the supply chain, which is quite convoluted, that they're connected to is actually employing, say, children or working too many hours, etc., which causes a real big problem for the branding image in the short term, and if they don't address it, then it's a long-term issue. So that's definitely something that will arise potentially in that case. And as with most industries, because of increasing awareness of the environment, reducing the environmental footprint can always be a topic. In this case, it would be more about waste products, I imagine, but it could also be to do with how extensive our supply chain is and the carbon footprint of all those vehicles, etc. So, what are the other issues that are maybe less tangible to our case, but are definitely feasible? Bribery, definitely, which links into professional ethics. So this is going to be about our board of directors, really, and whether they're doing anything a bit naughty, like agreeing deals that are against the regulations, like insider trading, bribing officials to get certain contracts. So if they were to supply a team, say, I don't know, a football club, and they were bribing one of the key people who make that decision as to whether they get the contract with money, then that would obviously be a big scandal, harm the business, harm the ethical standing, and just be all round poor. So this then brings us to, when we've got all this strategy, the mission, values, all these aspects that sort of tell us what the business is all about, how do we achieve that? And one of the key things is the critical success factors. If they don't do these well as a business, they will fail, essentially. And these will then relate, obviously, to what we've just covered. They are key factors that help us achieve what we're seeking in terms of objectives, values, quality, etc. So we did discuss these at length throughout the pre-scene and the other videos, but we'll recap them, of course. We have supply chain management as a real big one. It's all outsourced. It's heavily reliant on a bespoke IT system, which is a key source of competitive advantage. But obviously, when you use lots of technology, there will be an IT risk potentially, which could cause some supply chain issues. And because it's not all outsourced, communication between the different parties could be difficult because you're the intermediary. If you've got a problem with your supply and that holds up your supply to a distributor, they're not going to connect to each other. You're the intermediary, but the IT system may cause an issue, right? So that's a key thing. Obviously, the latest technology also applies to our fabrics and designs because we're seeking to be the most, affluent, the most performing sportswear brand on the market. So essentially, when you want to be an elite athlete, you will choose GSC instead of other brands. That's where they're going for. So they need to be on the cusp of innovation, essentially. Cost control is going to be a big one, especially in the sort of value-added departments that won't generate profit in and of themselves in a direct way. So the IT department, for example, will benefit the company with all these bespoke software systems, which really help the supply chain and other areas, but they're a cost center. So the idea is that you're providing the biggest benefit for the lowest cost. And that's where cost control might come in. Also in traditional senses of getting better materials at a cheaper cost. Maybe you're buying more of them at a time to help, that kind of thing. High quality in general is a critical success factor. You can't really have a premium pricing model such as this company without having that high quality all the time. So quality management is essentially the real critical success factor there. And finally, related to all of these, brand image. You need to have a really good branding for that premium pricing. So this brings us to the analysis of the stakeholders. So this is now going from where we want to be, what we need to do to achieve those things that we want to be, and then how do we associate those elements with how we interact with our various stakeholders, so our interested parties. So every issue has stakeholders, so this can also be a way in which we pick up technical marks. You might not think so because of the topic. It is an E2 topic largely, but it can be an interesting way to pick up some technical marks in some questions, because it's going to be important about treating the stakeholders as shown in Mendelow's matrix, for example. Keep informed, keep satisfied, etc. So let's take a look. And I did definitely bump up you'll see in a second I imagine, but I really changed my opinion on the suppliers and distributors for this case. Typically you would put them in the low power, low interest, or maybe the high power, low interest category, so keep satisfied. I did think maybe you could put them in keep satisfied in this case, but I personally think they are key players in the sense of how important this interconnected network is. Now, with that said, I may be overstating it. Maybe it is best to be put in keep satisfied, but I did want to present the case that you put them as key players because that supply chain is so long, so convoluted, and every step of the supply chain really impacts the brand image. And if the brand image is a critical success factor, well then you really want to keep those relationships really tight. So in my opinion, at worst, you put them in high power, low interest. I think they have a high interest in us, obviously, as a big provider. We're going to be on the cusp of innovation for some of the fabric designers. We're going to be, trying to sell a premium product in stores. We saw the exhibit of small stores being really keen to have GSC products. So I think there's this case to put in key players, but I would 100% respect the fact that they probably deserve to be in a slightly lesser category. But with that said, let's cover the other ones now. So minimal interest, low power is going to be something like employees of these suppliers. So whilst the suppliers themselves might care a lot, and we care a lot about them, the employees, they're just doing their job. With the individual members of the public, it's kind of the same deal. We're not going to be mega impactful to individuals, but maybe there's some interest there, but not really. So what about high interest, low power? That's going to be some of the smaller customers, so like smaller shops, if we do sell to them. There's a question mark as to whether these even apply, but I did keep it in. And minor shareholders, so they're interested, but they're only minor shareholders, so they don't have too much sway. Environmentalists, of course, really care about our ethical approach and our environmental footprint, our carbon footprint. They have a high interest. They don't really impact the company too heavily unless they were to band together and cause protests, which would hurt the brand image. So there is, again, some question marks on some of these depending on how high you value that brand image. I personally place it really high, and I think there's a case for some of these moving slightly compared to what you might usually put them as. In terms of high power, low interest, that's almost always lenders, banks, and the government. They have an enormous amount of power in terms of law and debt finance and sort of interest repayments, etc. But you're just a customer or just a company to them. You fit in a wider network for them. So they do have a big power, but they are relatively not very interested. So that puts us in the keep satisfied. So we have to satisfy their needs, which is timely repayment of debt interest, keeping to the law, etc. That kind of thing. Likewise, at the previous category, you would just keep them informed of your actions and why. You justify why, but you wouldn't necessarily have to cater to all of their demands. When it comes to key players, which again, you could move key suppliers, distributors down a notch, I'm going to keep them here just because that's where I think they're really important personally. And this is where you try to give them as much information and try to satisfy their needs as much as possible. And this is going to be the board, regulatory bodies who have an interest in keeping us in check. Large customers, so the biggest third-party retail stores will be important in that sense. And I think, again, suppliers, distributors that are really the big ones, the 5 or so that we're using for certain things, really, really important. So that is Mendelow's matrix. How these are not all of these are the typical placements. For example, key suppliers, distributors are actually sometimes put in minimal interest categories. So it depends on how you view the overall interconnectedness. But again, Mentor's Matrix is a really useful tool, and as long as you make a good case, you can put some of these anywhere. But I would recommend sticking largely to where they're typically put in most cases. Hello, it's me again. I just wanted to take a few minutes of your time to first extend my hope that you enjoyed the free sample that you've just viewed, but also to just sort of explain what else a strategy do to help you pass your exam really effectively, provided you found our sample particularly interesting and insightful, of course. So, of course, we have a study text for every module, ranging from P1 to F3, and the certificate level is also free on our website. So we have study texts throughout the CIMA course, every module you could hope to study. The certificate level are free, as I mentioned, and then the rest of them, ranging from P1 to F3, are all available to purchase. Alongside this, if you're not so much a study text kind of student and you prefer a visual way of learning, we have the course videos. We essentially break down the study text into bite-sized presentations with a walkthrough, and it's a very, very, very engaging way of explaining the course. Following this, we have the pre-scene analysis, where we break down each pre-scene sitting into a number of videos, going through the whole document, but also adding a top 10 recommendations for what will come up in the exam, and also a strategic analysis where we put all the models you'd find in E2, for example, to the pre-scene itself, whichever that may be at the time. Alongside this, we provide an industry analysis. This is a document and accompanying video which help you give that contextual information in your exam. So, for example, if the pre-scene's on the oil industry, the industry analysis will break down the oil industry, the current topics, trends, issues, what the competitive market looks like, all those kind of aspects, all condensed into one so you can spend your time wisely in your study period. Following on from this, when you actually want to practice all this knowledge, we have mock exams for all of our materials. So StudyText has a generic mock exam based on the module, whereas the pre-scene analysis has mocks available to purchase that are based on that specific pre-scene, that are targeted to the key issues we believe will come up. And if you're not content with just doing those mock exams and practicing that way, we have a marking and feedback system where you can purchase the ability to send in your paper, have it marked by a CIMA qualified accountant, and get personalized feedback on whether you can improve X or Y area. And sort of finally, if you will, if you're feeling really underprepared and that exam is coming really, really soon, the masterclasses are offered by Astranti, and they're essentially a crash course in anything you could want for that topic. So if it's a masterclass on the pre-scene, it's going to give you absolutely everything that you could possibly need to know about the pre-scene in one rather really condensed sitting. Likewise, if it was the F3 masterclass, you would have all of F3 gone through in a very crash course style presentation and video link. You can also purchase it post-stream as opposed to viewing it live, all these kind of aspects. We are very, very confident that these materials will help you get the exam success that you want. So we have a pass guarantee. Provided you fill out a form which demonstrates that you have utilized our materials to a large extent and actually taken the time to study them, and you have unfortunately failed, we will offer you the same materials again for the next sitting as a consolidatory offer to ensure that you can get back on the horse and get that exam grade that you want. With that said, thank you very much for watching the sample video. I hope you enjoyed it and it gives you a lot of confidence in Astranti and your CIMA future.